The truth is, like a lion, you do not have to defend it. Let it loose, and it will defend itself. Welcome back to Niger Education TV, your home of education and entertainment content. My name is Juliet Onra, and you are watching the nationwide e-debate 2024. This program is brought to you by Bring It On Africa in collaboration with the Federal Ministry of Education. And it's my delight to thank our collaborators, sponsors, partners. A special thanks to the new Minister of Education, Dr. Murufu Olatuji Alausa, the Permanent Secretary, Dr. Nasir Sani Gwazo, the Director Senior Secondary Education, Hajia Binta Abdul Kadir, the staff of the department that has brought this to reality, and also a big thanks to our host, anchor of this event, Benue State Government, the Governor, Hyacinth I. Alia, the Commissioner for Education and Knowledge Management, Reverend Dr. Frederick Ikiang, and also our sponsors, UNESCO, Unifinder, Learning Impact, Rotec Energy, Service, Women Awake. A big thanks to everyone, the judges, the moderator, the coaches, the debaters, and everyone, including you, the viewers watching from your screen. A big thanks to you all for bringing this into reality. Moving forward, I would like to welcome the moderator for this debate. And I will say today's debate is a tough one because we've seen this intellectual really defend themselves in an argument, and I will say it's been hot and spicy. Please help me welcome Deborah Emeka.
Good day, everyone. I am Emeka Deborah, the moderator of today's debate. For the semi-finals, the time still remains 8 minutes for each of the speakers and 4 minutes for the reply speech. The motion, floating of Naira is the reason for Nigeria's economic woes, will be argued by Team OYO and Team PLATEAU State. On my left-hand side is Team Proposition, with the lead speaker being Omotayo Emmanuel, the chief supporting speaker being Badigeshin Daniela, and the second supporting speaker being Oladapo Olamiposi. And on my right-hand side is Team Opposition, with the lead speaker being Nnamdi Jacob, the chief supporting speaker being Aya Mitchell, and the second supporting speaker being Dialog Nico. With this, it's my delight to call on the lead speaker of Team Proposition to open the case of the argument.
Good evening, honorable members of this gathering. Standing before you today is Omotayo Emmanuel, proudly representing Oyo State, the post-13 state, as the lead speaker for Team Proposition. Today we stand before you to speak in favor of the motion. This House believes that the floating of Naira is the cause of Nigeria's economic woes. Let me start by clarifying what we mean by floating the Naira. Currency flotation is a system whereby a country allows the value of its currency to be determined by the supply and demand system in an open market. This often leads to volatility as the fluctuation of the current value because of factors like inflation, interest rate, and the investment of foreign exchange. As Team Proposition, we'll be navigating through 3 arguments. We'll be comparing Nigeria with countries that have floated their currency in the past. We'll be telling you how Nigeria, as the flotation of Nigeria currency was affected by irregular timing and its effect. My first supporting speaker here will be telling you good day, honorable members of this gathering. Standing before you is Omotayo Emmanuel, proudly representing Oyo State as the lead speaker for Team Proposition. Today we stand before you to speak in favor of a motion. This House believes that floating the Naira is the cause of Nigeria's economic woes. As Team Proposition, we'll be navigating through 3 arguments. We'll be telling you, comparing Nigeria with countries that have floated their economy in the past. We'll also be telling you the impact of irregular timing and the consequences of Nigeria's floating, and also how Nigeria wrongly floated the economy and the effect. As the lead speaker, I'll be comparing and contrasting Nigeria with countries that have floated their currency in the past and the effects. My first supporting speaker here will be telling you the flaws of irregular timing and its consequences on Nigeria's economy. My second supporting speaker here will be telling you how Nigeria's economy was wrongly floated and how it should have been floated. Why some countries have successfully floated their currency? The case of Nigeria is distinctly different. Today, I'll be considering 5 countries, comparing and contrasting them with Nigeria, thereby proving to this house that the floating of Nigeria currency was not done at the right time. We have Indian decision to float their rupee in 1991 was because of their financial crisis. And when they floated their currency, there are some financial crises which they implemented the broad economic reforms, media liberation, and the investment in foreign existence. And now, India had a diversified economy. They invested in agricultural, spanning manufacturing system, and growing in the IT sector, which gave them the ability to manage the fluctuation of their currency. Nigeria, on the other hand, we lack diversification. We lack a strong financial system as well as a financial sector. Our vulnerability to extend shock, to a received shock, has led to a war in our economic sector today. We have Brazil. Brazil floated their currency in 1999. Due to the Asian financial crisis. Although the real value of the Brazil currency is devalued by 30%, Brazil recovered quickly due to their fiscal discipline, their export-driven growth, and their diversified economy. Brazil was less reliant on oil. They relied more on the agricultural sector with the export of crude oil, the export of coffee, their export of soybeans, and iron ore.
Hi, please.
As Nigeria, we lack diversification. Since floating the naira, inflation has risen, unemployment has been high, and debt levels is rising day by day, with over 60% of our revenue used to settle debt services. Brazil fiscal discipline helped them to go over the inflation of their currency, but Nigeria, due to our poor fiscal management, has left us exposed to more economic problems.
You said that you will be using other countries as a point of example. Members of the House, it seems the lead speaker does not know the motion. We are talking about Nigeria. Don't divert the motion to other countries. Talk on the reality and address the House.
Talking about Nigeria doesn't mean we won't compare Nigeria with other countries. Comparing Nigeria with other countries is showing you how other countries were able to successfully float their currency, and showing you what they had that Nigeria did not have, that is causing Nigeria's economic woes today. Also, we have South Korea in 1997. South Korea was forced to raise their currency due to the Asian financial crisis. Although the currency initially lost its value, South Korea recovered quickly due to their strong industrial base and their government policies. Key exporters like Samsung, Hyundai, LG helped South Korea to quickly get back on its feet and stabilize its economy. South Korea had industrial strength and their backing of the government. Nigeria, on the other hand, we lack the industrial strength and the effective government response. Our manufacturing sector only contributes 9% to our GDP. We haven't implemented the necessary structural reform that is required for a country after currency flotation. As a result, Nigeria remains vulnerable to the problem of currency flotation. We have Indonesia in 1998. Indonesia floated its currency in 1998. Although the Indonesian rupiah lost 80% of its value, it recovered due to international aid and structural reform, particularly in the banking sector and alongside the diversified agricultural and the manufacturing sector. Nigeria, however, we did not receive a relevant external financial support during our naira flotation. Our financial sector remains underdeveloped with the structural reform put in place, and thus it has left us to face a worsening economic crisis. We have New Zealand in 1985. New Zealand's experience was unique. They floated their currency. As a matter of it, they had a very small economy, relying on agricultural export and strong financial institution with a low debt service. But Nigeria today, our government has used our future, the future of Nigeria, as a collateral for loans that have been borrowed in Nigeria. We lack infrastructure, we lack policy, and the diversification to withstand the volatility of floating currency. In conclusion, honorable members of this gathering, the stories of India, Brazil, South Korea, and Indonesia teaches us a harsh but an undeniable truth. Currency flotation is a delicate but a dangerous decision, one that demands not only courage but the kind of resilience that Nigeria lacked when we made this decision. We were a nation with a fragile foundation. In rushing to float the naira, we were gambling with the future of our youth. We have seen the results. Inflation has soaring like wildfire, unemployment soaring, and investment countries departing from our country because of our broken economy. But this is not going to be our destiny. Nigeria can rise again. We cannot continue to gamble with the future of Nigeria. The lives of Nigeria at stake. It's about our brothers, our sisters, our fathers, our mothers, our children, and the future of the generation to come. The time to act is now. Nigeria deserves a better economy. And the power to get this economy is right in my hands, right in your hands, and right in our hands. And with this, I'm proud to propose. Thank you.
Thank you so much, the lead speaker for side proposition. I'll be pleased to welcome the lead speaker of side opposition to open the case of the argument.
Members of the House, the lead speaker and the proposition team managed to argue that floating the Nigeria is the reason, that floating the currency of Nigeria is the reason of Nigeria's economic woes. He kept on comparing Nigeria with other countries, which is not the context of our motion. We are talking the reality in Nigeria, not India, not other countries he mentioned. He also mentioned about vulnerability of the Naira. But I'd like to tell this House that it is through the overdependence of the Nigerian government to the oil sector. That is why it leads Nigeria to price vulnerability in the international oil market. Members of the House, floating the Naira is not the primary issue. Neither it is the essential cause of Nigeria's economic woes. Instead, it is a strategy. It is a symptom of deeper structural issues in the country. The Speaker, members of the House, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, humbly standing before his Ndam Jacob, the lead speaker in the Plateau State team, here to redeem the points, I have to negate the proposition. This House believes that floating the Naira is the reason of Nigeria's economic woes. But before I hit the nail on its head, permit me to explain and at the same time do justice to the key terms in our motion. Floating the Naira, also known as managed float, is when a country allows its market forces to determine the exchange value of its currency. Economic woes, on the other hand, is when the standard of the economy of a particular country is being decreased or degraded. This most of the times is compounded with overdependence on the oil and gas sector, as well as price volatility. This is compounded with the poor agricultural system a country has. This is compounded with the poor educational system, unstable political system, climate change, and environmental degradation. We, the Negating Constructive team, will present 18 strong, crucial, and vibrant points to the House. I, as the lead speaker, will be extensively and exclusively deliberating on the first 6. My first supporter will extensively deliberate on the next 6, while my debunker will persuasively deliberate on the last 6, and she will at the same time debunk, rebut, counteract, and condemn erroneous, baseless, and factual concepts, which I am very sure my opponents must raise in the course of this argument. She is going to do that by providing the House with statistics, scenarios, references, as well as valid examples to back up the claim of the negating team. Members of the House, when Nigeria as a country has overdepended on the oil and gas sector, making its economy to stand at a risk if there is failure in the oil and gas sector, you still say that floating the Nigerian Naira is the cause? When Nigeria as a country lack to invest in the educational sector, thereby not being able to produce good economists to manage the country's economy, we still say that floating the Naira is the cause? When Nigeria as a country suddenly forgot that the agricultural system was once the major source of government revenue and therefore failed to invest in it, do you still say that floating the Naira is the cause? To start with, overdependent on the oil and gas sector. Nigeria today overdepends on the oil and gas sector, thereby making the Nigerian government to stand at a risk if there is failure in the oil and gas sector, because this would destroy Nigeria's economy entirely. Do you know that the oil and gas sector accounts for over 90% of the federal government's export revenue? And at the same time, it accounts for over 60% of the government revenue.
POI Speaker.
No, thank you. I will get back to you. The COVID-19 pandemic, however, has witnessed a backslide in the oil and gas sector, as cash no longer move, businesses no longer hold, and the oil and gas sector were not able to sell fuel to the international market. This reduced the gross domestic product of Nigeria from 74.6% to 23.1% in just 3 months. Members of the House, the poor agricultural system, the weak agricultural system we have in Nigeria should not also be left out of this motion. Nigerian government tends to forget so easily that the agricultural system was once the major source of income. It will interest you to know that the government today spends more than $10 billion annually on the importation of food. These, however, make Nigerians to stand vulnerable at the international market when there are shifts or changes in policy on the importation of food. Many of our farmers, many of the implements they use, many of the machineries they use are outdated and does not conform international standard. This, however, increase the rate of poverty, decrease the standard of living, and affect the national economy. What's your POI?
Mentioned that the Nigeria system is not investing in economy. Do you know, in education rather, do you know that subsidy on education has been removed? And according to the International Monetary Fund,
members of the House, you have 15 seconds to answer.
Question.
Members of the House, you can't compare Nigeria's educational system with our counterparts in other countries. Do you know that the federal government of Nigeria allocated only 7% in the 2020 budget, which is not even up to the 0.5% as recommended by the United Nations Educational and Cultural and Scientific Organization, that is UNESCO. UNESCO recommended 15 to 21%. This has made the Nigerian educational sector not been able to equip schools with better learning materials, better infrastructural learning materials in order to train and produce good economists that will manage the nation's economy. Again, the unstable political system we are having in Nigeria should not be overemphasized in this motion today. All of us seated here will bear me witness that since after independence, most of the leaders, most of the elected representatives that represented Nigeria in the government were corrupt. 74.6% of the money allocated to eradicating poverty is being diverted into private pockets. The case of the recent suspension of Nigeria's Minister of Humanitarian Affairs and Poverty Alleviation, Dr. Beta Edu, is a clean example to this fact. She is said to have used a private account number in the ministry's financial transactions for the government social welfare, which is worth more than 585.2 million naira. Members of the House, if this huge sum of money will be tackled at eradicating poverty, don't you think that the Nigeria's economic sector will experience rapid growth? Definitely. Floating the naira is not and will never be the significant cause of Nigeria's economic sector. Again, the climate change and environmental degradation should also be considered. Environmental degradation such as desertification, erosion, pollution, flooding, as well as oil spillage in the Niger Delta led to the massive destruction of farmlands, led to the massive destruction of residential areas, led to the massive destruction of lives and properties, which has increased the rate of poverty, decreased the standard of living, and affect the national economy negatively. Distinguished panelists, members of the House, the policy change or the policy change decision is more of a necessary move in order to adjust to the current realities and changes in the global market. Therefore, floating the naira should be seen as an adjustment strategy rather than the root cause of Nigeria's economic woes, rather than the root cause of Nigeria's economic struggles. With this, let the motion fall. Thanks and believe this valid truth.
That was great. Bravo to you, the lead speaker of side opposition. I'll proceed by calling the chief supporting speaker of side proposition to further the case of the argument.
The chief speaker from the team opposition came here and said the chief speaker from the team proposition was deviating from the topic. But may I tell you that if we do not compare and contrast other countries with Nigeria, how would we know how Nigeria went wrong in the floating of the naira? He also said something about the government not investing in education. What about the 60 billion that has been allocated to invest in education? If there is no implementation of that 60 billion in your state, that means your state has to answer for that. When the Central Bank of Nigeria floated the naira on June 14, 2023, it was intended to stabilize the economy and create a more competitive currency. However, the timing of this decision was far from ideal. The naira, which was approximately 471 naira, experienced extreme volatility, leading to depreciating from 471 naira to 1,650 naira in just a few months. In Nigeria, we act before we reason, when we're supposed to reason before we act. We look before we leap, but in Nigeria, we leap before we look. A pilot was told not to fly because of the bad weather, but he insisted to fly, praying for a miracle. As he tried to maintain an altitude due to the turbulence, he wasted not only his life, but the lives of the innocent passengers in the aircraft. This is the vivid picture of what the menace of Naira float has caused in the economy of Nigeria today. Standing before you is Badigashin Daniela from Team OYO, the chief supporting speaker from Team Proposition. As my chief speaker has said, I will be expanding on the flaws of irregular timing in the floating of the Nigerian currency and its consequences. But before I go on, I'd like to reiterate what my chief speaker said. My chief speaker was able to give us instances of countries that have floated their naira, how they floated it, and the long-lasting effects it brought on their economy. From that analysis, we were able to see how those countries floated their currency and how it has led to a positive impact on their economy, in contrast to how Nigeria floated its currency, which has led to the woes we are suffering from today. Now to my major argument. This House believes that the currency should not have been floated as at the time that it was, because first, the naira is weak. When you float your currency, it means you put up your currency for competition in the international market. However, Nigeria's currency is so weak to the extent that it cannot compete with the weakest of currencies in the international market. Let us take the Ghanaian cedi, for example. The Ghanaian cedi in 2022 was just 40 naira. Now it is 80 naira. Also, the economy is unstable. According to the Nigerian Bureau of Statistics, as of September 2024, Nigeria's inflation rate has risen from 22.04%, has risen to 22.04%. A weak naira causes an unstable economic environment. The floating of naira has led to a climate of uncertainty which has affected both businesses and consumers alike. Furthermore, our country is more of a consuming than a producing one. The National Bureau of Statistics have proven that over 70% of Nigeria imports over 70% of its consumables, which include food, machinery, and other essential goods. Professor Ayo Olutoku once stated, Nigeria is a classic example of a consuming nation, heavily reliant on importing of goods and services. Because we have failed to consider the variable event that should warrant the floating of the currency of the nation, and we ignorantly moved ahead to float our naira, it has led to the devastating and biting consequences in the world today. First off, it has led to the increase in exchange rate volatility and inflation. According to statistics have proven that the inflation rate has risen to 24.7% as of October 2023.
UI, please.
Honorable, I'll get back to you. Honorable panelists, would you have believed if they told you that a bag of rice would go for 100,000 naira in this country? You would have termed that the person was a messenger of doom. But that doom is standing right before us as a reality. The naira volatility means the cost of acquiring foreign currencies have become increasingly unpredictable, leading to higher transaction costs. Also, we have the increase in servicing debts. Now, Nigeria uses over 60% of its national budget to service debt. Honorable panelists, how can a nation survive when it uses over 60% of its national budget for only debt servicing? Moreover, we have the policy uncertainty. Doctor, I'll get back to you. Dr. Bismarck Ruben stated that the floating of naira has led to a climate of uncertainty that deters investment, which has caused the navigating of exchange rate landscape. Now, when the naira was floated in 2023, it depreciated to the naira from the extent of 471 naira to a whopping 1,650 naira. Also, we have the exacerbation of the poverty level. Professor Ayo Olutoku eloquently stated that the naira's depreciation has created a ripple effect throughout the economy, causing exacerbation of poverty and unemployment as families now struggle to cope with the life crisis. Families before the naira floats that would operate on a 3 square meal now operate on 010, 001, and 100 because of inadequate cost. Students that have never trekked more than 1.4 of a mile now trek more than 2 kilometers because of inadequate funds. A good example is my chief speaker here. Emmanuel before was used to boarding the bus, but at the beginning of the academic session in 2024, he started trekking 1.5 kilometers just because of inadequate funds. Your POI, please.
It seems you are supporting the team negation. You said Nigeria uses 60% of its budget in servicing debts. Then that means that servicing debts Is the cost not floating the naira?
Servicing debt is as a result of the naira flows. Please listen before you raise a POI. Last up, it has caused an increased rate in the unemployment of the country. According to PLATEAU, in 2023, the unemployment rate in Nigeria has risen to a whopping 33%, attributed to economic instability and high operational costs.
POI speaker.
I'll get back to you. And the time for POI is gone, sorry. Now, the unemployment rate has caused a state of social unrest in the society that has proven that a state of social unrest in the society that has made youth engage in illegal activities such as Yahoo, cyber crimes, armed robbery, kidnapping, and all sorts of living, not because they want to, but because they need a means of livelihood to maintain themselves. Your POI, sorry, the time is not gone.
So what you're saying is that all these things did not happen until the floating of the naira.
We are not, hello, we are not saying these woes were not present. If you look at the word woes, a woe means a cry for help. Corruption was existing before the naira float, but it was not as profound as this. It was the advent of naira float that made people cry out in anger, that made people cry out in agony. Have you ever staged a protest of hunger in this country before the advent of naira float? But on August 3, 2024, there was a hunger protest in Kano just because of the naira float. As I conclude, I would like the rapt attention of the judges and everyone here present, and I would leave you to decide whether the naira float has actually benefited us. Sardine before the naira float was 300 naira. Now it is 1,800 naira. A can of milk before the naira float cost only 250 naira, but is now 1,500 naira. A module of beans, which is popularly known as Congo in the Nigerian parlance, now costs 5,500 naira. Gary, which was known as the friend to the poor, now left the company of the poor to join the rich. A module of Gary now costs 3,500 naira. You know, in this country, we were actually thinking we were rich. But when we were faced with the harsh reality of the menace of naira float, we realized that those who are rich are actually poor. Civil servants have now sold their cars to purchase bikes. Majority of Nigerian students have become perpetual leg wagons because of inadequate funds. Honorable panelists, if there's still anyone here that wants to say that naira float is not the cause of the economic woes in the Nigerian economy, then I can boldly say that he or she is not living in the harsh reality of the economy of this country. Proud to propose something.
Wow. Superb. Kudos to you, the Chief Supporting Speaker of Side Proposition. It is my pleasure to call on the Chief Supporting Speaker of Side Opposition to further the case of the argument.
The lead supporting speaker and the chief supporting speaker, the lead speaker and the chief supporting speaker for team proposition just came out to tell us that debt this, debt that. But let me tell you, wasn't Nigeria already suffering debt because of its over-reliance on foreign debts by other countries? Tell me. The motion that the floating of the naira is the reason for Nigeria's economic woes oversimplifies the complex issue by ignoring other factors that contribute to Nigeria's economic decline. Though floating has a hand, it is far from being the primary reason for Nigeria's economic decline. Good evening, impartial panel of judges, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. My name is Michelle Achai-Iya, the second speaker of Team PLATEAU, here to strongly oppose the motion which states, this House believes that the floating of the naira is the reason for Nigeria's economic woes. The naira was first floated on the 20th of June 2016, but before this, under the fixed exchange rate system, the Central Bank of Nigeria had to deplete foreign reserves. The depletion of the foreign reserve was made in order to maintain the value of the naira against the dollar. This led to the depletion of foreign reserves in the country, and it made Nigeria's economy vulnerable to external shocks. The move to float the naira was part of a broader path to bring transparency to the currency market and reduce distortions. Rather, the floating system is a system in which the market forces such as supply and demand affect the value of the naira. It is a more sustainable approach in the long term. How can my opponents come out here to say that just one factor can affect the economy of a country which has the fourth largest economy in Africa? Just one factor can move the economy of the giants of Africa. Impossible. I say that other factors contribute to the economic decline of Nigeria. I've not started. Firstly, debt dependency and poor fiscal management. Nigeria's economic dependency is influenced, Nigeria's economic development is influenced by debt dependency and poor fiscal management. According to the Debt Management Office, Nigeria's debts stood at 87.4 trillion naira at the ending of 2023. Nigeria spends a large portion of its revenue in order to pay back debts. How can you tell me that floating is the only reason that caused Nigeria to pay back debts to other countries? How? According to the International Monetary Fund in 2023, Nigeria's debt service cost was expected to consume 90% of the country's federal revenue. Secondly, inflation and domestic factors. Nigeria's inflation problem, which has worsened in recent years, is a result of the mix of different factors. Poor infrastructure, which increased the cost of production, and also transportation.
POI speaker.
Yes.
Now, you say that the Naira float is not the cause of our economic woes. But now, everybody knows that the Naira has been floated. So can you give us ways that the Naira float has helped Nigeria's economy, since it's not the cause of Nigeria's economic woes, with statistical backing?
Well, as we all know, the floating of the Nigerian Naira has not really helped because it has just been recently introduced. But, there are other factors that contributed to Nigeria's economic decline before floating was introduced in the economy. Secondly, inflation and domestic factors.
POI speaker.
All these problems are not as a form of direct result of floating, rather from lack of investments in essential sectors in the country. The Central Bank of Nigeria policies include handing of interest rates and money supply, which have a significant figure on inflation in the country. For instance, inflation in the country is widely driven by the rising food prices, which is caused by climate change, poor agricultural infrastructure, and also security issues in the north, which in all have nothing to do with floating. The rise cost of living by inflation erodes purchasing power, which makes it hard for Nigerians to maintain their standard of living. The inflationary cycle stiffens consumer demand and undermines domestic economic growth, thereby affecting the economy of the country. Thirdly, poorly regulated foreign exchange. A poorly regulated foreign exchange is one of the most significant contributors in Nigeria's economic woes. It affects the functioning of the economy by reducing the confidence of investors, fueling inflation, and also depleting foreign reserves. The foreign exchange market in Nigeria has long been a source of instability in Nigeria's economy. The volatility of the Naira in the foreign exchange market is one of the visible symptoms of a poorly regulated foreign exchange. A volatile currency can create uncertainty in the economy, making it difficult for businesses to plan and invest, thereby affecting the economy of Nigeria. For example, in Nigeria, between the year 2015 and 2020, Nigeria had multiple exchange rate systems, with the Central Bank of Nigeria having an exchange rate system of 360 naira to $1, while the parallel exchange system, that's the black market, had an exchange rate system of 480 naira to $1. Because of this, importers face high costs due to the devaluation of the Naira in the parallel exchange market system, while exporters struggle with a struggle to import due to the lack to restore foreign investments. Furthermore, weak health infrastructure and high disease burden. A healthy population is critical for a productive economy. Nigeria's health infrastructure is underdeveloped and is challenged by lack of medical facilities and lack of well-trained personnel, especially in rural areas. Poor health outcomes regularly, with poor health outcomes from high infant mortality to widespread of diseases like malaria, impacts the economy of Nigeria by reducing workforce and productivity. According to the World Bank, maternal mortality is around 512 deaths to 100,000 live births. For instance, malaria alone consumes Nigeria's economy, and it reduces the economy of Nigeria by 1.5 billion naira annually. Tell me, how does malaria have anything to do with floating? Yet, it still drastically impacts the economy of Nigeria. Long-term economic impacts of such health crisis outweigh the short-term impacts of floating, especially since health crisis has persisted over many years before floating was even introduced in Nigeria. This reduces productivity and perpetuates poverty. All these health issues have a far more significant and lasting impact on the country's economy than floating the Naira. Lastly, global dollar strength impacts Nigeria's economy. Strength of the US dollar in the global market significantly affects the economies of many countries, including Nigeria. The US dollar is a global reserve currency, widely used in international trade, finance, and commodity pricing. Shifts in the value of the dollar impact several key economic factors in the country, like foreign exchange reserves and exchange rates. One effect of strengthening the dollar is the depreciation of the
POI
naira,
speaker.
and this affects the economy of the country. In 2023, as the dollar strengthened, the cost of imported fuel and food also rose, which affected the lives of many Nigerians, thereby affecting the economy of the country. Contributing to Nigeria's inflation rate, which exceeded 20%. This made basic necessities expensive for Nigerians to afford, especially in low-income homes, and this worsened poverty levels. The strength of the UN dollars has far-reaching implications on the economy of Nigeria than the floating of the naira, which has impacted the economy of the Nigeria more significantly than the floating of the naira. Members of the House, can we blame floating of the naira for economic decline of the country, which has been plagued by other chronic issues such as political instability and high rates of corruption? Is it fair to blame the floating of the naira for high debt costs, or is the real issue Nigeria's over-reliance on foreign debt and its insufficiency to generate foreign revenues? With all these points I have presented to you this evening, can we still say that floating is the reason for Nigeria's economic decline? Panel of judges, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I now believe by these points I have presented to you this beautiful evening, you are now fully convinced that floating of the naira is not the reason for Nigeria's economic decline. Thank you, and let the motion fall.
Impressive. Thank you so much, the Chief Supporting Speaker of Side Proposition. It's my delight to call on the Second Supporting Speaker of Side Proposition to close the case of the argument.
The team opposition came here to mention something about dollar affecting naira. How could dollar affect naira if we are not floating our naira? It seems that the team opposition has forgotten that naira float is all about putting naira up for sale to compete with other currencies. Then how could dollar affect naira if we are not floating our naira? Naira float has destroyed destinies. It's still destroying destinies and will continue to destroy destinies if not stopped. Panelists, I'm sure that a few years ago, if someone had told you that $1 would be equivalent to 1,700 naira, you would have disagreed and termed the person a liar. But that is the reality that we face today. The rate of inflation continues to rise. The prices of commodities continue to skyrocket each day without promises of coming back. Team opposition, you want to tell me that the same way that you ate before the regime of Tinubu is the same way that you eat now? You want to tell me that the same way your parents pay your school fees is the same way they pay it now? A bag of rice in Nigeria now is now 100,000 naira. And the minimum wage remains 70,000 naira. How then can we say that floating of naira is not the cause for our economic woes? Standing before you today is Oyo Palamposi representing Oyo State. We the team proposition are here to tell you that floating the naira is the major cause and the reason for our economic woes. My first sovereign speaker has been able to give us the flaws of irregular timing in naira float and its effects. And I, as second sovereign speaker, will be speaking on how Nigeria has wrongly floated the naira and how they could have rightly floated it. According to the IMF in 2019, a floating exchange rate regime can be effective in absorbing external shocks, but it requires a supporting monetary policy framework, which we lack in Nigeria. And this brings me to my first point, wrong policy implementation. Policies that we have in Nigeria have not addressed corruption, neither has it addressed the excessive spending of the government, inadequate funds for state, that is the budgeting for states, and also inadequate resources allocation and generation. Also, according to the National Bureau of Statistics, in 2022, Nigeria was ranked 146 out of 190 economies that practice economy with ease. This means that Nigeria lacks the depth with which economy can be made with ease. Also, insensitivity on the part of the ruling class. When the ruling class does not feel the pain of the people, we know there is trouble. When the ruling class decides to turn deaf ears and blind eyes to the plight and cries of the people, we know there is fire on the mountain. The self-interest of our leaders has fueled corruption and has also fueled the wrong floating of naira. Our leaders have exploited naira float to solidify their connection and to solidify their control on our economy. The lure of wealth, the lure of power has intoxicated our leaders to prioritize their own selfish gain over our own need. The fear of losing this power has made our leaders to cling to this power at any cost, even at the demerit of we the people that they claim to lead. And finally, on this point, our leaders bow into international policies. Take, for example, the International Monetary Fund, which is one of these policies. These policies These policies, I'll get back to you, please. These policies are to loan countries money and also dictate to them how they pay it back. Let's take, for example, Nigeria loans 1 billion naira from IMF. And as at the time they loaned it, $1 was equal to 1,000 naira. But by the time we are going to pay this 1 million naira back, we are going to pay nothing less than 3 million naira. And this is because our economy, our currency is so weak, as mentioned by my first supporting speaker here. And that means that once we are going to pay, the rate at which the exchange rate would have risen, and will be paying nothing less than 3 million naira. Also, the IMF has confirmed that $8.3 million was loaned to Nigeria in the year 2022. Panelists, try to calculate with me. How much would Nigeria be paying back now? Also, 10.3% of our revenue reserve goes to the IMF. So my second part of this argument, how to rightly float the naira. Your POI, please.
Okay, Speaker. You said that floating the naira is the reason of Nigeria's economic loss.
Of course.
If Nigeria
You're taking too long with the question. Please be
if
fast.
Nigeria continues to rely on a fixed exchange rate, how does the proposition plan to address the inevitable rise in smuggling and black market forex trading?
Again, you're getting the motion right. The motion wrong. If we do not put up a naira for sale, there will be no need to compete with dollar or this black marketing or this fixed whatever you claim it is. Now back to my argument. How can we rightly float a naira? Currency floats requires greater transmission and transparency of the Central Bank of Nigeria and government. It requires a step-by-step strategy to mitigate the risks of inflation. Joseph Slickins once said, "Currency flotation is like a delicate dance between economic freedom and stability." The government should issue public address statements to the public about the process of this transmission and also let the public know each step that you're taking. They should also focus on non-oil services so as to reduce vulnerability to oil shocks and fluctuation of the oil market. As the saying goes, a currency without control sails towards inflation. Also, the consideration of a market-driven exchange rate. According to the World Bank in 2022, Nigeria exchange rate remains complex with multiple exchange rates, which has created uncertainty and undermined in the business confidence. Naira float allows the value of naira to be determined by economic forces, which is the force of demand and supply. The naira can then be moved to a managed float scenario where the CBN can still interfere, and are allowed to go for it for a smooth transition. Before I conclude my case, because I know that the team opposition will still come here to tell us that naira float is not the reason for our economic woes in Nigeria, I plan to cement the argument of the team proposition with the following statistics. The unemployment rate in 2015 was 7.5, but as of 2023, after the naira float, became 33.3%. Poverty rate in Nigeria in 2015 was 53.2%, but as of 2023, became 92.1%.
You are a speaker.
The inflation rate, your time for PI is gone, I'm sorry. The inflation rate in 2015 was 9.3%, but as of 2023, after the floating of naira, became 27.7%. In 2015, our exchange rate used to be 197 naira per dollar, but as of today, $1 equals to 1,700 naira. How then can we stand boldly here to tell us that naira flotation is not the cause for Nigerian woes? In conclusion, Joseph Slicktis once said, and I quote, you can't have a successful economy if you don't have a stable currency. The evidences are far clear and far too glaring to be ignored. Naira float has been a catastrophic policy for Nigeria, leaving Nigeria vulnerable to instability. As I leave this podium, I leave us all to a question to ponder upon. Can Nigeria's economy truly thrive under a floating exchange rate regime at this particular time, at this particular season, when Nigeria has no backbone? Proud to propose. Thank you.
That was amazing. Thank you so much, the second supporting speaker of side proposition. I'll proceed by calling on the second supporting speaker of side opposition to conclude the case of the argument.
While it is true that the floating of the naira has brought its own sets of challenges to Nigeria, it is not the main reason for the country's economic woes. The main issue lies on systemic structural problems.
that existed far before the floating of the naira came. Impartial panel of judges, my co-debaters, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I am Nicole Pereira Daliub, the third speaker for Team PLATEAU, here to strongly oppose the motion which states that the House believes that floating of the naira is the reason for Nigeria's economic woes. And I strongly oppose this motion with the following points. Firstly, subsidies and unsustainable fiscal policies. If the main cause of Nigeria's economic woes was truly the floating of the naira, why has Nigeria struggled with economic fiscal balance and fiscal and economic problems? For years, Nigerian governments have implemented policies that have drained public finances, distorted market mechanisms, and created long-term fiscal imbalances. Even the naira fixed at certain points in the past, this unsustainable public spending has led to growing of the national debt. Nigeria has spent billions of dollars. Nigeria has spent billions of dollars on subsidies, with information from the International Monetary Fund saying that Nigeria's subsidy bill has reached about 4 trillion naira in recent years. The impact of this subsidy far outweighs the potential negative effects of the floating of the naira. How can the floating of the naira be blamed when Nigeria trains its resources towards unsustainable subsidies that have led to distort of the economy and high bloated public sectors? Secondly, underdevelopment of financial markets. If the floating of the Nigerian naira was truly the cause of Nigeria's economic woes, why then has Nigerian financial markets been underdeveloped for decades, struggling to attract investments required for sustainable growth? Why? A lack of access to credit, weak infrastructure, and poor investor confidence have been long-standing issues long before the floating of the naira came to existence. Nigeria's stock market capitalization in 2022 was about 24 billion naira, which is low for an economy like Nigeria with the largest population in Africa. Moreover, the financial market is often plagued with low liquidity, high interest rates, and lack of transparency that discourages long-term investments. These structural issues are far limiting the economic growth of the country than any floating of the naira. Can the floating of the naira be blamed for lack of investor confidence when financial markets remain shallow, poorly regulated, and unable to foster economic growth and investment? No. So this has little to do with the floating of the naira. Secondly, Nigeria's dependence on imports. If the floating of the naira was truly the problem of Nigeria's economic woes, why has Nigeria heavily depend on imports for basic goods like machinery, food products, and refined oil, regardless of the floating of the naira? Yes, the floating of the naira may worsen the reliance, but Nigeria's long-standing trade imbalance and import dependence is far more deeper than the floating of the naira. According to the National Bureau of Statistics, Nigeria imports around 70% of its oil due to lack of refining capacity, and Nigeria imports a significant amount of its food, even though the country has high agricultural potential. Why is that? This reliance of imports places pressure on the financial exchange markets. How can the floating of the naira be responsible for Nigeria's import dependency when the country always lacked industrial capacity to meet domestic demands? This has nothing to do with the floating of the naira. Furthermore, Nigeria's weak infrastructure. If the floating of the naira were the primary cause of Nigeria's economic woes, why has Nigeria's poor infrastructure, such as poor roads, poor power supplies, and transportation, been a barrier long before the floating of the naira came? Because the country's inability to modernize its infrastructure has been a barrier for Nigeria's economy, not the floating of the naira. According to the World Bank, Nigeria's electricity power supply is one of the lowest in the world, with over 40% of its population not having electricity power supply. Imagine the national grid has collapsed twice in 3 days. How are industries supposed to work without consistent power supplies? Please, what does it have to do with the floating of the naira? Can the floating of the naira be blamed where all these barriers existed even before the floating came? No. Lastly, insecurity and regional conflicts. If the floating of the naira was to be blamed for Nigeria's economic woes, why then have Nigeria faced devastating insecurity and regional conflicts on the economy? Things like banditry, killing, kidnapping, and other forms have undermined the economic growth of the country long before floating of the naira. In 2022, terrorism and insecurity caused 20% decline in agriculture output in the northern parts of Nigeria, which is a key region for productivity in Nigeria, in the country. This has led to decrease in productivity and increase in the price of goods and services in the country. How can floating of the naira be blamed for economic crippled? How can floating of the naira be blamed for an economy crippled by insecurity, which has led to unproductivity in the economy? Lastly, lack of diversification and regional conflict. If the floating of the naira was truly the cause of Nigeria's economic woes, why then has Nigeria refused to diversify its economy away from oil? The country remains overly dependent on one source of exchange, which can shock the economy, and the floating of the naira cannot fix this. Despite efforts to diversify, oil still accounts for 80% of export revenue and 60% of government revenue. This has left the country over-reliant on one source, which can disappoint. How can we blame the floating of the naira for economic woes that are primarily due to Nigeria's failure to diversify its economy from one source? Therefore, blaming the floating of the naira can just be said as a misjudgment. With this cogent point of mine, okay,
You claim that subsidy is one of the major causes of Nigeria's economic woes, but the IMF has proven that for naira flow to be successful, there must be removal of subsidy. How then can you say that subsidy is a major cause when subsidy was removed in order to ensure the success of naira float? Explain to the House.
Subsidy was removed because the president, I know the president of the country has removed, removed this subsidy with hope to increase economic growth in the country, even though many people don't smile at it. Even as many people don't smile at the removal of subsidy, this shows that it's not the floating of the naira that is responsible for economic woes in the country.
You've not answered the question.
I have. With these cogent points of mine, I believe that I've been able to convince you that floating of the naira is not the reason for Nigeria's economic woes. Thank you.
Wow, the battle is getting hotter. Permit me, thank you very much, the second supporting speaker of side opposition. Permit me to welcome the lead speaker of side opposition to give his reply speech.
Have you been taught? Back to the podium, Mr. Ndam Jacob, the lead speaker in the negating team, here to give a brief and concise version of what my teammates and I have earlier presented. Members of the House, the affirmative team managed to argue that floating the naira is the cause or reason of Nigeria's economic woes, which is not true. The lead speaker mentioned of competition in the international market, thereby comparing Nigeria's currency to the Ghana cedi. But I'd like to address this House that Ghana floated their naira, but they invest in the educational sector. They invest in the agricultural sector. They invest in the tax system. That is why their economy today is standard. Again, the first supporting speaker also mentioned of about 600 billion allocated to educational sector. But I would like this House to consider this. The 2024 renewed hub budget presented by His Excellency Asiwaju Bola Ahmed Tinubu was 27.5 trillion naira. If you calculate how much is 600 billion naira in 27.5 trillion naira, you know that only 7% was allocated to the educational sector, which does not improve the production of better economies to manage Nigerian economy. Again, she also made mention of bag of rice turning to 100,000 in Nigeria. Had it been the Nigerian government invested in the agricultural sector, had it been the Nigerian government invested in what initially was the source of the government revenue, then definitely a bag of rice would not cost 100,000. It is because they depend on the importation of food from certain countries. That is why the bag of rice is 100,000. Therefore, the agricultural sector, the poor agricultural sector we have in Nigeria, is the cause of Nigeria's economic woes, not floating the naira. Again, most of my opponent points revolves around servicing debts. Servicing debts is actually supporting the negating team, because if the Nigerian economy depends on servicing debts, then definitely floating the naira is not the cause, and it will never be the cause of Nigeria's economic woes. Moreover, they made mention of economic crisis coming up after floating the naira. But floating the naira was done by His Excellency former President Muhammadu Buhari in 2016. Does it mean that there were no economic crisis before 2016? Members of the House, floating the naira still and will forever remains the cause of Nigeria's economic woes. Again, a point of information was raised to the third supporting speaker of the affirmation team. She ended up saying that the time has elapsed when the time does not elapse. This means that she is not ready. This means that she lacks the technicalities of this debate. Therefore, I call the attention of the judges to that. Again, the affirmative team mentioned of vulnerability of Nigeria at the economic sector. But I like to tell them that it is the poor price volatility that makes Nigerians vulnerable in the international market. As I have earlier stated, Nigeria depends and spends 10 billion naira annually on the importation of food, thereby making them vulnerable at the international market when policies were changed, when policies have been shifted. Therefore, floating the naira is the cause of Nigeria's economic woes. They also mention of high cost of living, which all of us seated here believe, and I am sure all of us seated here will support the negating team, that floating the naira does not bring any high cost of living. Initially, Nigeria, as one of the countries with the fourth largest economy in Africa, is still first in ranking in Africa with the highest number of poor people. That is why the first supporting speaker mentioned. The first supporting speaker in the affirmation team mentioned that poverty is the problem of Nigeria's economic woes. That means she's actually supporting the negating team. Members of the House, I believe with this, as I can see my opponents smiling, even the judges smiling and nodding their head in affirmation that floating the naira is the cause and shall ever remain the reason of Nigeria's economic woes. Let the motion fall.
That was great. Thank you so much, the lead speaker of the side opposition. Allow me to call on the chief supporting speaker of side proposition to give the reply speech.
In rounding off his speech, the chief speaker from the team opposition said that now he has been able to convince us that floating of naira is the cause of all economic woes in Nigeria. Now, he also mentioned that it was because we were not planting rice. That was the reason why a bag of rice rose to 100,000. But were we not planting rice before the naira float? It was the inflation that caused the rising of the price of rice to that extent. Now, we asked for the advantages of naira float, which they were not able to give us the advantages. The chief and the chief supporting speaker were just expanding on the same point, such as environmental degradation, climate change, overdependence on oil and gas, which means they were not even fully prepared for this debate. Now, also, the chief supporting speaker said that naira was floated in 2016, but she later said that naira was floated just recently. Is she not contradicting herself? Moreover, the chief supporting speaker also said that the US dollar impacts the Nigerian currency. How can the US dollar impact your currency if you do not float your currency? Also, my second supporting speaker mentioned that Nigeria borrowed 8.3 million naira. Now, if we're going to be repaying that debt, after the advent of naira float, we're going to be repaying at least twice that number because of the naira float. The chief speaker also said that managed float is the same thing as flotation or as full float. But Nigeria managed its float as the 28th of June 2016, and that was partial float. But the advent of naira float came in full force on June 14, 2024. This means all the arguments of the team proposition were on the wrong basis, which means all their arguments holds no water. The second supporting speaker also said that she knows the art of the president. Please, pardon me, are you relatives of the president that you will know why the president had to remove subsidy on fuel and education? Standing before you today is Gbadege Danila from Team Proposition, the return speaker from Team OYO, the return speaker for the Team Proposition. What have we, the Team Proposition, been able to bring to you today? We have been able to give you instances of countries that have floated their naira, how they did it, and the long-lasting effects it had on their economy. We're able to give you instances of countries like India, which had diversified economy, Brazil, which had industrial diversification, South Korea, which had export-driven growth, Indonesia, which had diverse agricultural and manufacturing sector, and New Zealand, which had low government debt. All the advantages that made their economy to grow is lacking in the economy of Nigeria. We were also able to prove to you we were also able to expand on the float of irregular timing in the floating of the Nigerian currency and the consequences. We were able to give you why the currency was floated at the irregular time, because first, the naira is weak. Also, the economy is unstable. Furthermore, our country is more of a consuming nation than a producing one. And we're also able to give you the consequences, such as increments in servicing costs, exchange rate volatility and inflation, exacerbation of poverty levels, low employment levels, and policy uncertainty. We were also able to give you how Nigeria has wrongly floated naira through wrong policies and implementation, insensitivity on the part of the ruling class, and leaders bowing down to international policies. But in order not to leave our debate hanging, we were able to give you how naira should have been rightly floated, which was through the consideration of a market-driven exchange rate and gradual transition of transparency of leaders. We asked the Team Opposition 4 POIs. They did not answer 2, and the other 2 was shallowly answered. They asked us 4 POIs, which were answered satisfactorily. The 4th POI was not answered due to the time, and I'm sure the chief speaker from the Team Opposition was not paying attention to the time. That was why he said we were manipulating the time. Without much argument from the Team Opposition, it rightly means, as the Chief Speaker said, that they have considered to the facts that naira float is actually the true cause of economic woes in the economy of Nigeria. Proud to propose. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we just witnessed World War III. On the floating of naira being the reason for the economic pros in Nigeria. I'm sure it's going to be a difficult one for the judges, but we're going to leave the judges to decide who wins this World War III.
Even viewers, we have come to the end of that first debate, the semi-final involving Team PLATEAU and Team OYO. And you believe and agree with me that it was a cracker. There was no dull moment. Each team tried to prove their onions. They try to use whatever they have in the arsenal to prove their points, but the judges knew what they were looking for. So I hereby read our resolution. Generally, they were very eloquent, the two sides, very fluent and composed. Team OYO, lead speaker in his presentation or proposition, tried to compare Nigeria with other countries. And he went on to tell us these countries succeeded, but didn't tell us why Nigeria had problem. PLATEAU team, in their reply speech, addressed that very effectively. The first supporting speaker from Team OYO seemed, to us anyway, to understand the motion better than the lead speaker. The rebuttal and POI were well taken, except the second supporting speaker. At the time, she seemed to argue against herself or themselves. This is our observation. For PLATEAU team, terms were defined better. They listed the causes of economic woes and explained them with examples to back their claims. Though they believe that floating of Naira is just a factor, they went ahead to list other factors. The POI and rebuttal were handled by the lead and first supporting speaker, though ignored by the second supporting speaker. Generally, they clearly understood the issues surrounding the motion and proved them with illustrations. And the judges independently gave winning to team PLATEAU State, meaning that there was a unanimous decision. Thank you very much for listening.